Monday or Tuesday, depending on when your class is. Let's review what I went over. I know sometimes it's hard in Zoom to keep up or to follow along if you're unable to make it. So I just want to quickly review what we did in class. Okay, we started with a vocab quiz. Okay, we started with a vocab quiz. It's just a quick review. It's in the first thing you got to do in the folder for the week. It's just taking 10 words, match them with the definition, and you can only have 5 minutes to do it, right? It's just practice, practice. We're going to keep practicing everything, right? So what we did today, let me see if I can get to my slide. All right, so again, reviewing the issue of rhetorical situation, right? The idea of rhetorical situation, ethos, pathos, and logos, okay? Starting to understand those concepts. Who is the speaker? Who is the audience? What is the message? And how is that message communicated? There we go. So the thing I've been trying to help you focus on, right, is the triangle of how to organize the different ideas, right? How you have the different points, right? The different points to look at speaker, right? Speaker, audience, subject. Speaker, audience, subject. Let me just flip that a little bit, okay? And then again, the sides of the triangle, sides of the triangle. The whole point of this is to help you focus on what are the different parts, look for one thing at a time, right? You're not trying to break through everything, but as one thing, just go through. Again, you're thinking of each level. Also keep in mind that as you analyze it, you can be looking for any detail in any order, right? So the idea for the analytical process is that you try to make it work for you, that fill it in as you need to. Some people need to start at level 1, right? Sorry, I'm trying to figure out. Start at level 1 and then 2 and then 3, okay? Other people, the way your brain works, just fill in any of it, right? Fill in any of it. When I bring up the passage, I'll go over these more specifically to help you, again, understand what it is you're looking for with each thing, okay? So before we read the passage, and I kind of dive into it a little more deeply with you, I just, again, want to remember that you're focusing on who the speaker is, right? And how they are communicating some sort of idea to an audience, okay? And as that is going through the passage that we read, right, we're thinking about who's the speaker, what do they reveal about themselves, how do they represent themselves, why is my forehead so shiny? This drives me crazy. And I either need to change the light or wear a hat. Who's the speaker? And then again, how are they communicating? What do they choose to communicate with the audience, right? We went back with the whole issue of the Gettysburg Address. Choices were made, right? Edward Everett spoke for 2 hours. Probably the worst speech ever. But then again, when you look at Gettysburg or Lincoln's Gettysburg speech, this is it. This is the entirety of Gettysburg speech. Maybe less than 5 minutes, a couple minutes. Okay, absolute bro is our Lincoln. Okay, because he chose not to bore us, but just focus on what's important. Right? Focus on what's important. All right. Okay, the next thing, again, what we're thinking about and where we're going with this rhetorical analysis, right, is starting to think about what are those important concepts? What are those important concepts that we are trying to get to? Okay, so again, if we're thinking about that, the idea is that there are these certain universal themes, right, or social issues that all writers talk about, okay, and that's really what they're trying to get at, okay? Whatever the passage is, there's usually some concept they want you to understand, some truth they want to reveal, some idea, common human idea that they want you to understand, right? So as we work this year, we'll be starting to look for what are these common ideas, and then that can guide our analysis. The thing to keep in mind is that anything you read, the goal is to think about that big idea. Okay, so again, the goal is to think about the big idea. What's the big idea? Whatever the speaker says to the audience, right, is to help them understand what that big idea is, what that big idea is. So the trick is not to get caught up, in the physical or literal things they talk about, because it is never about what it's literally about. You have to be able to look at what are they literally discussing, what are they actually discussing, but then what is the bigger, broader concept that they're trying to push you to? Okay, so they literally use things that they literally talk about: physical objects, real world situations, real world locations, real relationships, things in reality, but then actual mental concepts that they want you to understand. And that's, again, what all authors go through, right? Trying to establish that there's this physical thing I'm going to talk about, but it's really moving towards this mental concept, this idea, going back to some sort of universal theme, that's the word, universal theme, or social issue, right? This idea, I'm going to talk about something literal in the world. So what we're reading this week are examples of this. Concepts and examples to understand how to go through this process and know what to look for, okay? So let's dive into the first passage that we are reading this week to try to understand what's going on.
Let's take a dive into the actual text. So if I am thinking about my text and I'm thinking about how I'm thinking about the text, then I have to keep in mind, get out of the way, thank you, how I look at the text on different scales, right? I look at the text as this whole blob of words, right? So when we zoom out to look at everything, okay, going through your annotations is to change it from a big blob of text to more manageable little pieces so you can see all the little pieces together. The idea is to be able to see, as they say, the forest for the trees, right? So instead of looking at this huge forest that is mass of foliage and trees, that you can pick out the individual trees, right, that are part of it. So that's really what your analysis is looking to help you with, to break things apart, to identify individual ideas. So as you zoom in, mentally zoom in, analytically zoom in, you can start to see how the ideas progress from beginning to end, and then how the author develops those ideas from beginning to end. Okay, so as you read, the breaking into different sections is important. Annotating important lines, highlighting as you go through is important, and then also remembering what the structure is, how the organization works. One thing I always recommend is read the last thing first. Read the last thing first, because that's where they really get to what their main point is. If you start off with, you can get distracted from what the main point is. Especially this one is very, I think, a very good example of how the way they start can affect your interpretation or understanding of what the passage actually means. Okay, so let's start going through the passage itself. And as I mentioned previously, excuse me, going through the passage, right, starting with the very first section, you can see he is very intentionally affecting your perception of him, right? You are a human being, right, with a language that comes out of a culture that has values attached to certain words, certain situations, certain people. And that's what a speaker can manipulate, those associations with words, those values you have as an individual, of a culture, of a society, and can then use that to affect a certain reaction. So by him starting to say, again, my first victim was a woman, white, well-dressed, probably in her early 20s, bringing in the word victim, bringing in that's a woman, bringing in that she's white, well-dressed, right, creates this reaction to who we think he is. And that's his whole purpose, right? That's his whole purpose, to bring up and make us understand that cultural perception we have, that cultural assumption we have about him as a human being. Okay. So he goes through, right? He's using diction, okay, intentionally choosing a certain word, threaten, and again, you want to add some sort of adjective before diction, threatening diction or dangerous diction, diction of danger, right? Um, strongly emotional diction, possibly, right? So it brings in this connotation, makes the look speaker as a criminal, and as again, everything is spaghetti, affects his ethos. Okay, so the use of this diction is mixed in with affecting his and developing his ethos. But then he adds to that the description of himself: broad, 6 feet 2 inches, with a beard, billowing hair, both hands shoved in the pockets of a bulky military jacket. Right, seem menacingly close. So this continuous diction of danger. Okay, military jacket, menacingly close, and then within seconds she disappeared into a cross street. So this is where he leaves us with a question, and that's what we want to notice, right? So at first I thought she was a victim, but then he doesn't do anything to her. And this is what he wants. He wants this contrast, he wants this confusion, because that will lead us into this thought process that he's trying to take us on. And that's where what we'll notice in this one, there is a lot of ethos that he uses to develop his identity, but then the passage is more logos based, right? He's trying to lay out a logical thought process for how we need to change our perception of Black men in society, and how that perception in society, as we get to the very end, in turn recursively affects Black men. The next section, he goes back and gives us more overview of who he is, right? Gives maybe a more honest description of who he is. Notice at times as you go through, there's a couple spots where this happens, where you can pick out individual sentences that work as a quote to represent the overall idea or overall concept. So always be kind of on the lookout for standalone sentences that you can pull out and use that to represent what the purpose is, because oftentimes they will try to very succinctly and artistically explain what their purpose is. So the ability to alter public space in ugly ways is part of his purpose, right? Part of, or I would say more of his topic, right? As I actually put in my notes there. Okay, his purpose builds off of that topic, and that's part of what we need to keep in mind. Topic leads to purpose. This is what he wants to focus on. We do something about the topic. The purpose is doing something about the topic. So he wants to bring up this issue of how the mere presence of a Black individual alters public space, but then he wants us to do something about that. We bring up a topic in order to do something about that topic, right? So if there's any other topic that someone might bring up, say climate change, for example, you bring up the issue of climate change because you want something done about that topic. So if we're keeping that straight in our mind, right? The connection between what the topic is and what the purpose is. As he continues his description of himself, right? Self-described a softy, adding to the characterization of who he is, right? Building off of, right, that first assumption that we had, and then adding in this more honest perception of who he is. Okay. And this is really the issue, right? That contrast between who he actually is and how he's perceived. Contrast is one of those very important rhetorical concepts that that comes up a lot, and it gets used a lot. Okay? There's this contrast between who he is, who he's perceived to be. Going through the rest of the paragraph, right? Using this individual moment to represent the broader issue. This is something else that writers often do, where they use a specific situation as an example, okay, as an example of the broader topic. And as we get to the very end of the section, closer to the end of the section, did I not break that apart? Maybe I break that apart. Here again is an example of where you can find an individual sentence that has a broader universal truth to it. So thinking of what writers and how they create their sentences, it could almost be one of our vocab words, an aphorism, where it's the sentence that transcends just the individual essay and has a more universal application. Where fear and weapons meet, there is always the possibility of death. And this is something you can see over and over again. It has more than just the application to his personal situation. It has a broader universal relevance. So as you're reading through, the other sentences you see are particular to the essay. They only really work within the whole essay, but something like that could be pulled out and has that universal significance and importance. As we're reading through, right, he keeps giving these different examples, right? And that's part of what you notice, how a writer writes and what type of references they make. The language of fear at dark, shadowy intersections. Another example, another situation. So he brings up this topic of how Black men are perceived and how that affects the public space. And then he keeps giving these different examples, right? And he adds to the reality of it, right, by using this imagery so we can clearly be in that moment, right, to draw us in and add to the reality of the situation that he discusses, right? We can hear the thunk, 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 thunk of the driver. We have this automatopoeia. Onomatopoeia. Yeah, did I get it? I think so. No red squiggly there. So using the onomatopoeia to add to the imagery, which brings us into the reality. As you are working through your analysis, you just remember it's not just like pointing out like, oh, look, there's imagery. You want to say, look, there it is, but then why do they do it? What's the purpose for using that rhetorical device? In this instance, okay, the imagery brings us into the situation. It makes his personal experience also a shared experience for the reader. So we can also imagine kind of that feeling, right? We can put ourselves in the idea of walking by somebody, walking by a stranger, and hearing the thunk, 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 thunk that represents this ungrounded fear. We get to the end of the section, right? So again, just laying out all these different examples and going back between discussing his overall topic and then giving examples for it. For the next section, okay, we're always paying attention to topic sentences, always noticing topic sentences. As we learned in elementary school, hopefully, maybe 5th grade, topic sentences are the indicator of what the whole paragraph is about. So that can also be helpful to make sure that you use that to your advantage to understand how the passage is put together. So we can see with this topic sentence that he's moving away from his own individual experience and to something that is the experience of Black men in general, right? As we go through, right, we also notice he's going to examples from the past. And if I'm thinking about organization, right, he is giving personal examples, things that have happened for himself, and then moving into broader examples. So it's not, again, showing not just his experience, but the more general experience that all Black men have had. Using quotes, right, trying to support his discussion. And then in the next paragraph, so bringing up this concept, right, concept from somebody else, and then putting it back into his own experience, right, going back between a universal and the personal, right, the universal experience and the personal experience. So if I asked you what the purpose of this section, right, is to give more credibility in a way to his own personal experience, to show that it is something part of a broader, that it's not just him that is experiencing this, but his experience is representative of other Black men, right? More than just him. Again, going through now and further into his past, right? So if the first example, again, we're kind of tracking his timeline. So he starts with when he was 23, right? Noticing that when he is speaking from this, he's 33, right? You got to keep track of chronology. Now he goes back to like how we got up, everything before that first moment that he starts the passage with. Okay, going in again to his history, trying to connect to more than just his own experience as he looks at the experience of other men around him, right? Trying to just understand, right, how this works. So it's using these personal anecdotes to work through this thought process. And this is where we see this essay, this passage is more logos based, right? Some of the other ones we read, they might be more emotional based, right? This one is certainly more logos based, where it is trying to lay out the sequence. He's clearly developing an argument to persuade your thinking, right? Not necessarily persuade your emotion or your trust about or your relationship with someone, but again, trying to make you clearly recognize and accept this idea that he lays out, like this again series of situations, keeping going back from himself to the more universal. All right, as we keep going this section, noticing that it's not just him, that he has these relationships as examples. Next section, going back through, just like jumping through all these different examples, echoing where he began, right? So kind of continually adding to more depth and support for this concept that he's trying to establish, giving you this first situation, second situation where he is viewed as a criminal for just his mere existence. See, I'm in section 5. Just trying to, and here's the difficulty, right? He is trying to persuade people of something that they have no idea exists, or might even refuse to admit exists. So he has to go through and logically lay out these examples to persuade you that this is a real situation, right? This is a real experience that he has, and by extension, as he has done, other men have, other Black men have. Okay. So he goes through just a series of anecdotes. So if we're thinking of how to organize our analysis, remember we can give each section maybe a short synopsis, right? A short little summary of what it is, a series of anecdotes. Each one, right, where he just innocently is doing something, but then the reaction of everybody else in that public space treats him like he is that criminal, right? And this is why if we can see it now, this is why he began that way. He is trying to have us, the reader, go through that same assumption and that same failed perception that happens to him over and over and over and over again, right? So we can see that we kind of made that same mistake at the very beginning. That's section 5. So now as we get to the very end, okay, so this is where his main point builds to. And this is why I say, whenever you read or analyze something, you want to begin with the end, right? Read the last thing first, because it can make it easier to notice what that idea is and not fall into getting persuaded by the eloquent rhetoric they might use in the passage. So here he goes at the end. He kind of goes through the sort of the concessions that he has to make, the changes that he has to make to himself because of other people's failed perception of who he is. So how he has to change what he does because of other people's failings, right? And at the very end, we get this very similar situation to where he started. on late evening constitutionals along streets less traveled by. I employ what has proved to be an excellent tension-reducing measure. I whistle melodies from Beethoven and Vivaldi and the more popular classical composers. So notice, right? He is using very different diction, very specific diction that shows us he is as educated. So that's again connecting to ethos. Notice this also is an allusion. The streets less traveled by is an allusion to a poem by Walt Whitman. So again, showing that he's educated, showing that he is in contrast to the violent criminal that he gets assumed to be. Okay? And he whistles melodies. He doesn't just whistle music, he whistles classical music, classical composers. Even steely New Yorkers, hunching toward nighttime destinations, seem to relax, and occasionally they even join in the tune. Virtually everybody seems to sense that a mugger wouldn't be a warbling, bright, sunny selection from Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Probably. The very last sentence, it's my equivalent to the cowbell that hikers wear when they know they are in bear country. The whistling is his equivalent to a cowbell that hikers wear when they know they are in bear country. So when a hiker goes in bear country, right, they have to wear a bell to warn the bears, to maybe scare the bears away, to let bears know they're there and that they're not a threat. Okay? So at the very end, we have to notice the reversal. He is the one in danger, not the people around him. Okay? And that is the most important point that he gets to at the very end. In the beginning, we thought he was pursuing a victim. We thought he was the predator, the dangerous one. But by the end, he is the victim. Okay? He is the potential victim because of that treatment that he gets in a public space from people around him, right? So he now is in potential danger. So this contrast, right? So we see this reversal by the very end. And that is ultimately his purpose. So where I said before, his purpose is about, let me find where it was, the difference between topic and purpose, right? The ability to alter public space in ugly ways, right? The way Black men in public space are viewed is his topic. But his purpose is something about that, right? So his purpose would be to change, right? To change that, to change our perception and to prevent and remove that danger that men like him have when they are in public, right? To not be viewed as something dangerous, and for us to recognize how dangerous that assumed criminality, that assumed perception affects Black men in that public space. Okay, that's where he gets to, again, this overall purpose by the end, by reversing that perception, by reversing that role that he has in the story from the predator to the victim, right? Helps move us to recognize what our purpose must be for this passage. Okay.
All right, if we are talking about the just walk on by passage. Okay, so we went through and we looked at all the different sections. Let's fix that so I can zoom out, right? Thinking about all the different sections, all the different ideas that he develops through. So let's try to put it in some sort of sequence of thoughts to understand what was happening before, what happens in the text itself, and then what does he want to happen after. Okay. In remembering that for going through the levels of analysis and going through the different boxes, you can do them in any order, right? There we go. Sorry. Okay. You can do them in any order. So if we're thinking about, we don't have to start with the thesis, right? We can fill that in later. Usually you want to go through that whole thought process before you try to identify what the thesis is. So what event, incident, or situation motivated the speaker to speak? Perpetual encounters with people who think he is a criminal. Racism and prejudice, right? Growing up with people who had tragic outcomes. Okay, so then this is something we get clued into, and you can see that all the things that he experienced in his life, he uses in the text, and those were, we can see the motivating factors. So oftentimes what the topic is, what they have you focus on, is the exigence, right? The topic is often the exigence. Not always, because depending on who the person is, they might go a different way, but topic is often exigence. Often, I can spell. Topic is often exigence. So what does they do? Multiple personal. I'm going to type, and I'm going to figure out how to write words. Examples. References to people he knew. Oh boy, look at me, what I'm doing. Thank you. Manipulating the reader's perception of his ethos. Right, that's, again, a big one. Okay. Contrast. Make a big contrast. His ethos is different by the end. What choices did he make? How he presented himself. Chose a more logical argument. Again, laying out the sequence of ideas, sequence of events. For some reason, we're going to figure out why. Let me adjust. Boop. Look what I can do. I can highlight. Don't we love Microsoft Word? We do. All right. So this is like, again, another passage where the change in the outcome is more internal rather than like an external action or change. Obviously, ultimately, he does want change in society. Okay? Change in society and racist perception of black men. Okay? And so again, if I maybe jump to the next one, stop treating, or I could say perceiving, right, black men, criminals. Stop treating, perceiving, assuming black men as criminals. And so again, we notice there's also the two-way, right? There's the perceiver, right, the one seeing him, but then also the one perceived, the ones that are seen. And freedom to just be in the world, right? That's kind of what he wants. He wants sort of that racially tinged perception to be gone, but then at the same time allow him to have that freedom that he wants to just be in the world, right? To go without feeling threatened, right? If we go back to the very end, he doesn't want to feel like he's in danger when he's walking. That's the ultimate goal, right? That's the ultimate purpose. This is why he would tell us everything that he goes through, right? He's just not wanting to point it out that there's the racism and prejudice and this danger that he feels in the world. He wants it to have some sort of change. Okay, so it's not as explicit as other speeches. So if we go back to purpose, I'll make a comment, not as explicit as the Sojourner Truth or Florence Kelly speeches, right? They had a very clear purpose. It is directly laid out in what they want to happen, right? And this one, it's still in there, but you have to piece together the different ideas and concepts that he discusses. Okay, so as we go through, what's his thesis then? Am I going to come back to it, right? Something he uses his experience in public spaces and how he is treated as a criminal to emphasize the damage that's done to him in order to fill in the blanks, right? So as you do the thesis, you're combining all those three different steps, those three different levels into your thesis, right? Connecting them through into a single thesis. Okay, so those are the different levels of analysis, filling them in as you go. So for the boxes, again, if you like the triangle, then write the triangle. If you do the boxes, then we like that. The speaker, Brent Staples, he's 6'2". No, that's it. Can we do it? 2. Bushy beard. We know he's a writer, right? He's worked as a reporter. Those are things we get about his personal history. He is a black man. What else? There may be more. I don't know, things you guys thinking about. Again, if we think of the audience, right? All people that need to see this. Could there be maybe more of an intended audience? Possibly. He has a higher motive for who needs to read this, right? If we think of a secondary or unintended or implicit audience, right? There are definitely people who need to read this, who need to know this, right? Subject topic, perception of black men in, and we'll just use his title, right, in public spaces. This is the issue. Right, did I say that? I think I had said that at the very beginning. So as you're filling in the triangle or the boxes, right, you can be looking through your annotations, right, to see what then can be organized into the different boxes. Yes, okay, I think I had that there. How the mere presence of a black man affects the people and location around them, right? Again, the title just gives it away. Okay. Black public space. Okay, rhetorical appeals, perception again, and ethos. Okay, context. What do we remember? What time period this was? Do we remember what time period this was? I don't think I have the date. This was published in 1986, right? Published so in the 70s and 80s. Late 20th century. Okay, I mean, though, of course, America, right? It could easily be published in 2020 as in 1980. Real, okay? Thesis purpose, that's what I had said before. Change perception. Remove the danger, right? So he can just, again, just be, he just wants to live, okay? Tone, dangerous to innocent, right? So again, he starts off dangerous, proceeds at the very end to, again, he is just the innocent person there. I don't know, I get this sense of like, again, he's very logical, methodical, just kind of laying out ideas, sequence of examples, right? So if we're thinking of, when I look at each paragraph one by one, what does he move from one paragraph to the next? And again, I'm calling this organization. calling it audible and changing it. Sequence of personal examples. Okay. Rhetorical devices, contrast, he uses imagery, anecdotes. What else did I have? Fill them in there. Right, so again, collecting to see how does everything fit together. What you would then do, if you would like to talk about or discuss this text, each one of these you would be able to choose and focus on for something to say or something to focus on as you were trying to connect back to what is this thesis that you are developing.